Yeah, he owes me. I told Charles a few minutes ago, I hope the preacher's good this morning because I'm sleepy. Well, here we are. And I appreciate very much those kind words from God, and it's good to be here. I always appreciate the opportunity to come. The invitation to be here is something that's highlighted my year, and I always enjoy having the association of those that are here. To be able to see the work that goes on at the school, and for lack of better terminology, to see the product that comes out of it is something that continues to be a significant source of encouragement. I know those congregations that are beneficiaries of the work that's going on here, and so I appreciate the elders of the congregation here and those that are instructors at the school, because it's obvious that this is your handiwork. It's one of those things that being a craftsman on occasion, which I have been known to do, I have built a number of different things. I built my own bedroom suit, just a few little things like that. I'm also a musician of sorts and written a number of songs, and when you do certain things like that, you put your name to it. It identifies you with those particular things. And when you begin to see some of these young men go out into different places and be able to succeed at what they do in being gospel preachers, you be satisfied with the fact that your name's attached to that somehow or another. So it's one of the things that you also have to take into account when you work as a craftsman. If in fact that you're going to be successful at doing so, you try to do the absolute best that you can, because there are others that are doing the same thing. And so if you're going to compete with others in that respect, just from the standpoint of producing a good product, you want to make sure that's the best that you can do. And that's what's being accomplished here, and I'm glad to just have a small part in our involvement in it, particularly at Plainview, and in the investment that you make here in carrying out the lectureship. And I know very well that it's a very expensive product that you have to produce here. But that's for the investment of the school, and we're happy to be part of that. I appreciate again the theme. These themes that we have been dealing with for the last couple of years, a little bit out of most of the preacher's purview, because most of us don't spend a great deal of time in study of history. And many of us did when we were back in school, but it's hard to develop a significant amount of interest in some of the places and the congregations where we might be in these particular areas. And this is something that needs to be developed a bit more. And some of the conversation I have had, and some of the points that also Guyton has made as to the reason why we discuss some of these things of this nature, is you take into account the fact that there are those, if I might use the same example I did in conversation the other day, here you have X, which represents the Bible. Here you have Y, which represents something other than that. For example, you will find the catechism or the extra words that Martin Luther might have added to what had been found within the scriptures, but they're passed off as X. And now what we have to do is there are those that are using Y as something equal, or should be at least acceptable, of the population itself, and those of us need to be able to have the capacity to be able to explain to people the difference between Y and X, and that their dependence is going to be on X and X alone. It's not going to be something that's going to be by virtue of what man has stated, so that difference needs to be understood. It would be like going to a doctor. Now you're feeling a little bit rough in the chest. You may be expelling blood or something of this nature, and you go to the doctor and he explains to you, well, I think that you've got lung cancer. That's rather serious. What do we do about it? Well, I wouldn't worry anything about it. Everything else will be okay. It's just in your lung. So everything else, as far as your body is concerned, will be fine. So as long as you don't do anything with that, then I guess you'll be okay. Now, you wouldn't have a great deal of confidence in a doctor that would tell you anything like that, because you know as well as I do that if you have any knowledge concerning what cancer can do, it is going to spread and eventually is going to kill you. Bingo. Now you've got the situation that is set up where you have a world that has the particular disease of error that's being spread by these different churches, as was noted yesterday, better than 10,000 of them. Now you've got to know the disease. It is important for us to be able to recognize it, to be able to defeat it. The doctor that's going to treat you for that cancer has got also to be mindful of what kind it is. for him to be able to defeat it, because a lot of them are different. Now, many of the denominations, as have been brought up, are going to be basically teaching this tulip doctrine, but not all of them have the very same differences, because you're going to meet up with someone who's going to be teaching something different even in all these different denominations, and you need to be somewhat familiar with the wiles of the devil, do we not? Well, it's certainly the case. Then by knowing these things is the reason why we cover them. Now, I want to also bring this to our attention as we enter into this particular study. As Guyton announced to us, we're going to be talking this morning about the Hutterites. Now, the Hutterites and the Amish, the Mennonites, and the Anabaptists all stem from the very same source. These are basically all the very same people. There are some differences that exist between them, but the similarities have its basic foundations. They are basically all the same. They stem from the very same groups. And so when you hear us discuss during the course of the lectureship the background for all of this, those that are speaking on these issues do not hesitate to talk about the background, even if it's repetitive. I learned a long time ago from Brother Robert Taylor, the 3 R's of learning is repetition, repetition, repetition. And so it's not going to hurt us to be able to hear these things again and again to establish a context. Now, there's a reason again for that, because you may be here and hear what I'm going to be talking about today, but somebody else may not hear when we're going to be talking about the Mennonites, the background from that, so they may not have any context if you don't provide that, because I may have presented some of it. Those that are going to listen on the recorded devices, they also need to have a context. They may listen to what I'm saying, but they may not have access to the other DVD or whatever. They need to have context. So to be able to kind of understand what it is we're going to be discussing, know that that's what the approach that we're going to be taking. Let's take our minds back just a little bit to this particular period of time, and we're talking about the early 1500s. Now, you remember again that the primary rule of the day is the Catholic Church. Now, I'm saying, let me emphasize that again, the primary rule of the day is Catholicism. The Pope wields power over most kings, over the parliaments, and all of the forms of government during that time, because of the expansion of Catholicism throughout the known world. He's the one that primarily calls the shots, whether you're talking about power religiously, whether you're talking about it civically, politically, and militarily. If there's going to be a war, he's going to be the one primarily is going to tell the king or the leader as to whether or not it can be done. Now, some of the kings are going to end up bucking him at some point in time, but primarily up to the time that you come to the 1500s, they're still the primary source of power. Now, a couple hundred years before, you had some that were beginning to make a swell of opposition to him. Now, Wycliffe and some of the others that were trying to producing some translations during that particular period of time, and you remember what it was that happened to him. And just to summarize the circumstances regarding his effort after he tried to translate the Scriptures where the people get a hold of it. You remember he ends up, after he's died, he's been dead for several years, they dig up his bones, burn the bones, put the ashes into the river. Now, this is not just to show their disdain for Wycliffe. Why else do you think they would have done that? That was a message. That was a message for anyone else to not ever try again what he did. If you do that, it's going to be the same things that's going to happen to you. Your legacy is going to be stained by what we do. But nevertheless, you have those that are continuing and striving after they begin to learn. The translations start to come into their hands, and they're beginning to discover now, when I look at what the Scriptures teach and what I've been sold by Catholicism, these things don't match. And now you have those like Zwingli and others that were trying to bring about this Reformation. Is what ultimately led Luther to nail his 95 Theses to the Abbey door. All of these were the beginning aspects of the real effort to depart from Catholicism. But there were those among the reformers that were not completely satisfied, and so you've got some here in Switzerland, three gentlemen particularly, Conrad Grebel, Felix Manz, George Blaurock, that decide that they are not going to remain under the auspices of Catholic rule anymore. And so a couple of the primary elements as far as their division from Catholicism would be concerned, number one was the issue regarding infant baptism. I'll deal with a little bit more of that Wednesday night, but one of the other primary elements to this had to do with the principle of self-governing. That became the issue. Because when you start talking about the matter of power and self-governing, if the Pope is going to not be allowed to have his rule and his way, that also is going to be something translated to many of those that were the civic leaders, the kings, and otherwise, that is now considered a threat to the status quo. And so now, these fellows, that's some of the principles upon which they begin their movement. They rebaptize each other. They baptize one another. Those that watch this, they refer to them as having been rebaptized, because these were gentlemen that had been baptized as infants. And now as they have been rebaptized, they were referred to during this time as being Anabaptists or rebaptizers. They didn't particularly like that term. They thought it somewhat derogatory. They came to accept it sometime later. They would refer to themselves as the Swiss Brethren, but it was not something that was going to hold simply because of the fact that they would be migrating to so many different areas. And so it was just a term basically stuck with them. They had to undergo a significant amount of persecution. One of the gentlemen that is of those three that we're going to be primarily focusing on, at least for a few minutes to start with, is that George Blaurock. He, of course, was from Austria, but he was spending some time preaching these concepts in the area of Switzerland. He was eventually expelled from there, goes back home into Austria where he was from, and he was very successful in some of the things that he was trying to accomplish as far as this movement was concerned. Converted a whole lot of folks. And one of the notable ones of which he also converted was a fellow by the name of Jakob Hutter, which we'll talk about just a little bit in a moment. The name which actually is attributed to this group of followers here. But after going through a significant amount of period of persecution, you're going to find that they begin to move around in different places. They would go into Germany, going back into Austria, eventually into Czechoslovakia. Well, they found some reprieve here, at least in Czechoslovakia for a while. Now, a lot of these countries during that time, they don't have the same borders as they have now. You had several that made up areas of Czechoslovakia, Moravia, Bohemia, and some of these others. And so you'll hear some of those names that will be part of what is known as Czechoslovakia. So they come up into this area. They are received and tolerated, at least, by one of the noble families, the von Liechtensteins. Now, the nobles were those that had huge estates, thousands and thousands of acres. And here, these von Liechtensteins allowed these particular Anabaptist refugees to settle in on their property. And they grew mightily over the next couple of years. And so you're talking numbers that now come into the thousands. 12,000 people is estimated about how much they had grown just over the movement that has gone about 2 years at this point. Now, from that point, some of the other nobles are a bit concerned about that growth, and knowing also that what it was, some of the primary principles that they were upholding. You got to remember again the culture. The culture is still guided by Catholicism and by those among the reformers who are just simply trying to reform the Catholic Church. And then also you've got the leadership that is concerned about the concept of self-governance. So some of the nobles are trying to put pressure on the von Liechtensteins to get them out. Now, the Baron, evidently, is going to come to their defense. Look, there's 12,000 of these people. They haven't bothered anybody. They're carrying out their own work. They're minding their own business. And you have to think about it like this too. There's 12,000 of them, and many of them are able-bodied men. So it perhaps is the case if, in fact, we end up having to have a military campaign. You just think about how it is that we can draw these men in as conscripts and use them in the military campaign. And the nobles saw the plausibility of that, and they were able to concede, at least for the time. But now, here's where some of the problem comes, because now the noble is going to carry this back as a proposition to those among the Anabaptists, these Hutterites, as they will eventually become to be known. Now there's a problem. Because here among the Anabaptists, you have to remember also one of their original decrees. One of the original decrees in the establishment of the Anabaptist movement was pacificism. You weren't going to be able to engage in war, and you couldn't use anything that you have for the purpose of furtherance of wartime. So there's a discussion that exists among them. Now, it's a small group, but there is a break-off. Because there are those that are totally committed to the idea of the original decrees that established this particular group, led by a fellow by the name of Jakob Hutter. We are going to remain passive. We're not going to fulfill what it is that these people are desiring, knowing that this is likely what's going to come anyway. But there were those among the rest of them that decided, well, you know, if it comes to that, maybe it won't come to that at all. But if it does, we will be happy to defend the lands. So 200 of them left under the leadership of Jakob Hutter. They sold what possessions they could sell for funds that they would need. Everything else that left. Basically, they become quickly impoverished. That's during that time. That's when Hutter established this concept that identifies primarily the Hutterite group. This concept of community of goods. It's based on the idea that you'll find in Acts, the 2nd chapter, where you see the early disciples, they had all things common. Well, that's where this stems from, and the establishment of this particular idea. So now you go from this, where they extend their time. They're moving around. Most of them are going to be spending time somewhere else in the area of Czechoslovakia. They begin to flourish at least a little bit during this particular time. They're still having to operate somewhat clandestinely, because they're operating still within a system and culture that is opposing the idea of their self-governance. A little bit later, there is another group of them that has come from Tyrol, Austria, which is, of course, where Blaurock was from. He, incidentally, preached until he was executed in 1529. After this, there's a little bit of gap in the leadership, and that's where Jakob Hutter comes into play, because he fills that gap. And now in about 1529, he, along with some of the other refugees, must make their way up into Austerlitz. And as he gets up into this particular area, he spends some time here, and he eventually becomes the chief elder of the Hutterite communities, what would be eventually known by, or they would be known by his name. Now, a couple of years later, in 1535, you got the Moravian king, Ferdinand, has now begun to see that they're beginning to expand. This threat settles in again. And so now his pressure is being put upon the nobles, and the decree is made, you get them out of the lands. And so now they are. They're now left as impoverished refugees. But now at this particular point in time, Hutter has already developed a reputation. They know that he's dedicated to this cause. They know he's determined to see to it that it's carried out. He's not one of those that is likely to compromise. They see him as the head of the snake. We've got to cut off the head of the snake, and maybe we can eradicate the movement. They put a price on his head. He makes his way back home into Tyrol, Austria. This all clandestine as much as he could do, and the rest of the movement as well. They hold their line and hold their numbers for the most part at that particular point in time. Then there's still some that are in areas of Czechoslovakia, and he's made the effort in 1535 in November to make his way back up into Moravia, do a little bit of mission work. But that didn't work out very well, because they capture him November 29, carry him back to Innsbruck. They're going to put him on trial. Now you think about this for just a moment. They catch him in November 29th. They put him on the trial. They torture him. Now you remember you talked about yesterday, we talked about yesterday concerning what some of the Catholics will do with those that are opposing Catholicism and adamantly opposed to them. Particularly, they're going to try to get them to confess what it was that they had done and pledge their allegiance back to the Pope. And if you don't do that, they're going to torture. Now, if you went ahead and pledged your allegiance, confessed your sin, they would kill you quickly. Make it merciful. But now if you don't do that, then they're going to torture you. Okay, they catch him on the 29th of November. They take him to Innsbruck, try him and convict him. They torture him because he's not willing to be one of those that's going to compromise, and eventually, after torturing them in February, they're going to burn him at the stake. Now, the movement itself is something that continues to hold. Those that remain continue to try to hold the movement together. And they were making it okay, but they were still having to operate in such a fashion as to somewhat be clandestine in the efforts that they're making. But then when you come to a period of about 1565, there was a great period of tolerance for them, and religious tolerance. And between that and 1592, it was called the Golden Years, they were able to expand. They flourished. This is where they began to develop their industrial nature, and these were some master craftsmen. I don't know if you've ever seen some of the Amish, Mennonite, and Hutterite works, but what they do is just, they're master craftsmen. They began to develop carpentry like no one had known, clockmakers, leather workers, all different kinds of craftsmen, and they excelled in that and excelled in farming. They began to develop an educational system that was not known like that in the world. In fact of the matter is, most of what you find in the educational system that exists in the world today was something that was developed by these people. Now they're flourishing, and you come into a period. In fact of the matter is, they have flourished so well, by the time you get to 1621, there's estimated at that time about 102 different of these communities, and your numbers are coming into 20 to 30,000 of them. Now that's important to remember, because now, even that's by 1621, but you go back just a little bit. While they were flourishing through these years, there is a time when things begin to change, especially when the Romans get into it with the Turks. Now, when this war starts, the Roman emperor has come to figure that I don't have enough funds to finance a military campaign. So he has to increase taxes. That's on everybody. And that's including the Hutterites. And so what he's going to do is try to gain taxes from them, and that's not part of their decree. They're not going to allow what they make and the gains that they have had in order to be used for military campaigns. So they refuse, but that's not going to stop the emperor. So what he's going to do is he's going to constantly send raids there. Now they're continuing their work. They're continuing to profit from the works that they're making, but also the Roman emperor knows that, and he raids these communities for the next 13 years. So now, they're having to deal with that aspect of their existence, not being able to profit from the things that they're making. Most of it's being collected from and taken from them and being bartered off or sold by the Roman emperor. Now, they just barely get over this. And when you come now then to 1618, Now the 30 Years' War starts. And so you've got the war that exists between the Catholic states and the Protestant states, and these people are caught right in the middle of it because they don't like them anyway. When you're looking at a situation among the Catholics and the Protestants, they don't care for these people at all. They were not going to accept them simply because of the self-governing idea and also because of the situation or the teaching regarding infant baptism. But the matter of self-government is one of the big issues. So now, in 1622, the Hutterites are expelled out of Moravia. Now they're completely impoverished. They don't have anything. Now you put yourself in this situation just a moment. You know, I got to thinking about this. We live a rather cushy life. We live in a situation where we have the freedoms to be able to enjoy worshiping, carrying out our work for the church in relative ease. We're able to assemble this morning in a comfortable place without fear of reprisal. At least we are mindset that that's the circumstances. But I begin to wonder as to how we would react if we were faced with similar situations like these people. If it came to the point that you had a bunch of godless heathens that overtook this country and made the decree that we as Christians were not to, we'd have to give up on our Christianity or leave, what would we do? Now, some of these people, they're faced with this at this particular point in time. Some of them are just absolutely worn out. I've had it. I don't see the reasoning for this, and for the survival of my family, some of them return back into Catholicism. Others give up on religion altogether, and they just flee and disperse into different areas throughout the areas of Europe. But then there's an interesting thing that takes place. In 1755, the Austrian Empress has expelled some 275 Lutherans to one of the remote sections of the Austrian Empire. Now that's rather fortuitous for the remaining Hutterites. Now remember, I mentioned a moment ago, they had flourished to a point where they had about 102 communities. They were numbered between 20 and 30,000. Now, by this time, by 1620 or 1755, you're talking about more than 100 years now, you're looking at a point where now they're down to about 50 that were known, at least in this area. And this is somewhat, let's say, somewhat fortuitous for them, because now you've got 275 of these Lutherans that are brought up in the area, and they began to kind of work, they find one another. In fact, the matter is, the Hutterites convert some of the Lutherans to the Hutterite religion. They begin to flourish a bit with some of the others that lived in and around the vicinity. Well, the only thing about exiling somebody, if you're going to be exiled, the government's going to check on you. And so the Empress was going to keep check on those areas, and come to find out the Hutterites were there. They're also swelling here and beginning to grow. Well, now she's concerned about that again, and so she's doing everything in her power to get them out. They learn of it, the effort, and they began to migrate again. They go through Romania and eventually into Russia. Now the Russians accepted them. They didn't bother anybody. When they came into Russia, they also discovered that were some of their Anabaptist cousins were already there. Some of the Mennonites were there, a group led by Johann Cornys. And so they kind of gathered together there, and they began to reestablish themselves. They reestablished their industrial nature, their educational system. All of this began to flourish all over again. And then you got another problem. Because this goes on for a period of time. Like I say, they are growing, they're flourishing. In 1873, the Tsar of Russia set forth a decree. All the males have to join the military. Here we go again. Now, if you're among these groups and you've been through all of this before, you want to throw up your hands and say, what's the purpose in going through all of this? And they have made the decision that it's the best thing for us to do, even if the government is going to concede some way or another to allow us to keep us from doing this so that we don't have to compromise our ideals and then work against the decrees that upon which we've been established to be passive. You get a group together, an envoy of the Mennonites and the Hutterites, and they're going to send this envoy to America to see if there are lands there where they can settle. And they do. And this is going to take a little while. Because eventually you're going to see that the Hutterites find properties and lands in South Dakota, and then they're going to come back and they're going to tell the rest of those there what they have found. Now the Russians find out that these people are threatening to leave. That's a panic. Now the panic sets in because there are 45,000 of these people that are some of their finest farmers, and they're feeding the population. We don't want them to go. They're helping to provide for us. So they begin to try to concede, but these people have already been at these places before. We'll go through this and they'll pull something else. They've had it. Now it is the case that many of them did stay. But based on what I'm able to understand, some 18,000 of them left. They settled over in South Dakota. They set up colonies there. Some also in North Dakota, and eventually would cross the border and go into Canada. Most of them still settling in the areas of South and North Dakota. These colonies are rather interesting, the communities are. When they initially came into those areas in the 1870s, here you're going to find they established 3 communities. And when you go in those areas now, you'll find the different communities with the different names, usually that are attributed to a particular leader or an idea. They established 3 communities to start with, one called the Smitalute, the other the Risalute, and the other is called the Lairlute. Now, Lute is colony or community. That's what that is. And then when you start looking at the terms themselves, the Smitalute is that which follows a fellow that was a blacksmith, a Schmied. And so those that were more industrial would gravitate in that direction. Then you had Darius Walter, he was the leader of that group, so they called themselves after him. And then a layer is simply a teacher. And so those that would follow after that particular group were also known as the Lairlute. Now in the Lairlute, or in the lutes themselves, what you had this particular setup as far as the system was concerned. You had a minister who's basically your chief executive, which is kind of odd because while it is the case that you look at him as a chief executive, he oversees the things spiritually, but it is the case as well, he is not really the top dog when you start looking at it, because in the particular communities that are established, and they try to keep the communities at a particular number. You know, if you've got a congregation here of this group of people and it gets to a particular point, then they break off of that and make another one that comes to that number, whatever that specified number would be, and then they'll break off and make another one. So here you may have a community that has several different congregations, but then you have a chief elder that oversees them. Now you know as well as I do, and what they refer to this is their faith community. Now again, this is language that is foreign to us that know the Bible. Now we know if we want to use the term faith community, how do we establish that as far as our understanding of the Scriptures is concerned? We call it the church. That's what that is. But now we're not separated necessarily in different communities except in places where we may live, and we all come together in our faith community and our assembly where the church is. Now, We know that congregations that we find within the Bible were told to appoint elders in the plural. This is something that's foreign from what these people are doing. You've got a chief elder. One of the other aspects of their establishment of their community, and this is something that's rather important you take into account, they had a colony manager. These people do not have personal bank accounts. All of this stems back to what Jakob Witterman started, and Jakob Hutter, he's the one that more, I suppose you might say, made the concept of community of goods such to an extent to where it made it work with all the different communities. He was able to make it work. And here's how that works. No one in these communities is able to profit themselves. If in fact, as a result of the efforts or the work that you do, and you get compensated for that, what you do is you take that compensation and you give that to the colony manager. All money goes to him. And so now if there is a need that you have to go see the colony manager. And the colony manager determines as to whether or not your need is worthy of the funds in order to take care of it. That's what this system does. But it also, when you start looking at their worship, is some interesting things. Their worship is a lot like what you're going to find among the Mennonites and among the Amish, although there are little bit differences. They have what's called the Gebet. This is a little worship service that they have every evening after the evening meal. Then when they have their worship service on Sunday, you know, we talk about when we get up, we're going to go to worship. They go to lair. We're going to go to lair. When you go to lair, they sing from what is, somebody's going to determine a particular topic upon which they're going to sing, called the Vord. They will determine what that topic is, and he will assign a particular melody, and the people are going to follow along with that. You'll have a prayer. Then you're going to have the lair, or the teaching. Now, their system of beliefs, and I've run out of time as far as this is concerned, but this is something that we'll cover a little bit more on Wednesday night, because again, it's something that is similar to what you're going to find among all the other Anabaptists. But there's a couple of things I want to note before I stop. Again, if you start looking at what it is that they have established as far as their system of beliefs is concerned, one of the primary disagreements that they had with Roman Catholicism was the baptizing of babies. They determined this as being absolutely unbiblical. Their idea is they came to, after they began to study the Scriptures, began to realize that baptism, of course, even in their baptism, is still just a matter of either sprinkling or pouring, but at least they have the idea that it's something that is only to be used and administered upon those that were believers and were willing to submit to that act. Something that a baby could not do. Also, the idea of the separation of the church and state is required, as we've already pointed out. Their concept of self-governing became one of the primary issues. They don't want to be guided or overseen by any government or any other religious entity. They govern themselves. And that's what many times was viewed as one of the primary problems. And if you look through some of the other things that you might find in your book there, they consider the Lord's Supper a symbolic suffering of Jesus, which is in fact correct. The only problem with that is the frequency in which they take it. Most of them just do it once a year. At least they had some idea of the truth as to why it would be carried out to start with. And then they practiced what's called the ban with them, based upon principles you're seeing in not only Matthew 15, but primarily what you find in Matthew 18. When there are those that do not repent after they have had the matter discussed with them, and they don't do this, then remember the Lord taught, says we treat them as a heathen or a publican. In other words, you withdraw your fellowship from them. Well, they call it a ban. And the minister is primarily the one that's going to be administering that. He's in charge of much of this and carrying out these forms of discipline. So there's a number of things that we could talk about in that respect, but time is gone. But, you know, you start looking at some of these individuals and the teachings that they uphold, there's a few things you can learn from them. One of the things that I have ascertained from my review of these people is I have learned what people will go through when they're truly dedicated to a cause. And it would seem to me, you know, when you think about what it was that John was facing, what Peter and some of the others were facing, especially when John was having to deal with those among the Gnostics, when there were those as well that were just completely opposed to Christianity and trying to eradicate that even in the first century. I think about some of those in the second century that were facing some of these great persecutions, and I think about Polycarp and his unwillingness to concede. And at 80 years old, they tie him to a grease pole and light him up like a candle. And without any sense of fear whatsoever. And I wonder again, how would we react if these same similar sorts of situations were ever to face us? The idea of dedication to a cause, my friends, is exactly the reason why Jesus died. He did that for us so that we could develop that same sense of determination. That is something that I've learned from them. I also learned their error. We can learn a lot of things from their error. How it is that we're to stand against those things, learn about them so we can defeat them. But learn from the dedication. One of the things also that's very instrumental about their behavior is their humility. They emphasize that. Oh, how we need that. How we need that. Many other things we could talk about, but just don't have the time. I appreciate your attention, and perhaps maybe this will be of some help, because on occasion, maybe situations arise where you're going to have to deal with something similar to this, but this did play a significant role. What you're seeing along with these Anabaptists with the history of religion during this period. Appreciate your attention.